Jack Rutberg, and I'm delighted to present this exhibition entitled Sculptors from Degas to Ruscha. There are a lot of surprises in this exhibition, and one of the biggest ones is a friend who previewed the exhibition asked me, Jack, how long did it take you to put this exhibition together? I mean, it's quite a remarkable range of artists. And I thought about it. It took me about 50 years, actually, because all of these works come from the gallery's holdings, from my personal collection, the gallery, and bringing them all together may appear to have no curatorial focus. The challenge was really to bring disparate works, disparate mediums, works ranging 125 years. The challenge of putting this together was really to do this in an aesthetic manner, in an intimate space, the kind of space that one would see perhaps in a home. Stepping back, we see the relationships that this may have actually been a curated exhibition where works of art spanning decades, even a century apart, have direct relationships and influence upon these various artists at different times. I'm standing in front of this amazing work by Francisco Zúñiga, a masterpiece really, a work that has astounding presence, but a beautiful sense of calm and elegance. And we look to other artists who have impacted Zúñiga decades before he even was born. And the elegance of Francisco Zúñiga is seen in this stunning work in onyx of this reclining woman. And here, 3 sketches of a figure in preparation for sculpture. And as Zúñiga's works bring such elegance and calm, a sense of respect for the figure, here we have a work by Maillol, created before Zúñiga was born. This is done in 1905. Zúñiga was born in 1912. And Francisco Zúñiga was very well versed in the early moderns, one of the most important sculptors of his day. So what we see in Maillol is his desire to create an elegance, removing from the figure the kind of expressionism of an artist such as Rodin, which was equally celebrated in that time. Interestingly, the connections between these artists are actual, not merely a projection of what they remind the viewer of. Maillol's inspiration early on was Gauguin. Gauguin's influence to Maillol was more when Maillol was a painter, but the impact that Gauguin made is very clear. So we have in proximity Zúñiga, we have Maillol, we have Gauguin, and here's this wonderful work, that a bronze cast from his wood sculptures that he did, 2-sided, showing here this Tahitian imagery and this classic head. And here we have another bronze by Gauguin. This was actually cast from what is thought to be terracotta or clay in Paris, actually, in 1894. But here we have a bronze that was cast from that. These specific Gauguins that I mentioned were actually traveling in museum exhibitions, and here we bring them to the public in an opportunity for collectors to consider them for their own acquisition. And contemporaries of Maillol, of course, the great Rodin. 2 etchings by Rodin. This one, a portrait of his wife, symbolizing, however, the Republic of France. And here we have another work by Rodin, an etching. It is based upon a poem from Dante's Inferno. We're delighted to have these in context to these Maillols and Gauguins. And of course, on a whole other level comes the surprise. And here we have this remarkable bust of Mathilde Salm by Degas. At the late part of Degas' life, he was losing his sight, was working heavily in wax, but he only did a few portraits. And this model, who was A premiere ballerina at the Paris Ballet, was a very favorite subject of his, treated in numerous paintings. And here we have this bronze cast by Degas. Another surprise in the exhibition are works of Max Klinger. Not particularly the best known artist by Americans, but one of the most critical artists of the late 19th century. He was a brilliant etcher. We hope one day to present a great Max Klinger exhibition, as I've collected Max Klinger for decades. But here we have a work by Max Klinger in etching and a sculpture. Klinger was a remarkable sculptor. His monumental works exist primarily in Vienna and Germany, but they're extraordinary, connected to the symbolist movement. But his impact was profound. He was responsible for so much that evolved even into surrealism. Imagine that someone like Philip Guston, in some fashion, through lineage, came to be impacted by Max Klinger, because Guston was hugely impacted by De Chirico. And when Max Klinger died, De Chirico, the great metaphysical surrealist painter of Italy, wrote a manifesto speaking to Max Klinger's remarkable impact on metaphysics. As an etcher, Klinger was remarkably important. Edvard Munch never did an etching of a print until he saw Klinger's works. He was so moved, he experimented with prints on his own, and of course, Munch has created some of the most important lithographs, woodcuts, and etchings of modern art. Klinger's impact also was profound on what I regard as perhaps the great woman artist of the 20th century, and that's Käthe Kollwitz. Käthe Kollwitz, was recently honored with an amazing exhibition in the Museum of Modern Art. The Getty Museum also presented a heroic exhibition, which unfortunately was cut short because of the COVID outbreak. But Kollwitz also did some very powerful and poignant sculptures, and we have here a very beautiful one entitled Rest in the Peace of His Hand. It was executed around 1935. Very few were cast in her lifetime because bronze and metal wasn't easily available in Germany for art. It certainly wasn't a high priority. Her works were banned by the Nazi Party, but she was never molested because Kollwitz was so profoundly admired by the public that Hitler felt that, or she felt that Hitler could not afford to martyr her. And she remained unmolested during the war and felt that her family was safe as long as she lived there. Los Angeles has a huge history with Kollwitz collectors, as great German emigres came here just before and during the war and post-war, of course. But here we have this remarkable work by Kollwitz. I bring this all together going back to Maillol because there's this magnificent sort of calm and mood that is portrayed, and we see it. It started with Zuniga in our conversation, and Zuniga was well aware of Kollwitz's work, hugely inspired by her, and we see these connections endlessly. So while this exhibition may seem ever so random, the connections are profound. It was, in fact, Henry Moore that attributed a great deal of his impact by Maillol. The distillation of the figure for its elegance and not expressive qualities, but the simplification of form is seen in Henry Moore. So we connect all these artists. Henry Moore and Zuniga were well aware of each other. They visited each other. So we see this connection in this gallery. So how long did it take me to curate this? Well, it's really about 125 years because these artists did it for me. Here we have this wonderful small bronze by Pierre Bonnard. Bonnard's so well known as a painter, but how many people have actually seen a sculpture by Bonnard? Worked primarily in terracotta, from which works like this were cast, the bather on the rocks. On this assemblage of works on the wall, we see pioneers of the 20th century. Max Weber was the first American cubist. Anytime someone says the first, the best, it's always open to qualification. But indeed, he went to Paris, I believe 1905, engaged people such as Matisse, Picasso, was introduced to the Cubists and became friends with them, came back to America around 1909, introduced New York to Cubism, and he was a remarkably important artist. We see today, with the sensation of influencers and the marketplace, history sometimes takes a back seat. You can be part of this equation. These are works that are available for collectors, museums, but these are things that we can have in our homes. The scale of these works, from the monumentality of this large Francisco Zuniga we saw, to the intimacy of a work such as this Max Weber or Reuben Nakian. Here we have a work by Reuben Nakian, who can be argued to be among the most profound sculptors in America. Why is that, I say? Because he may have been among, if not the first of the expressionist sculptors. De Kooning never did his first sculpture until 1969. I believe that's correct. Several years earlier, Nakian had this monumental exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art. He introduced this kind of very abstract classical works in the sense of their source. He was dealing with mythology, but in a very expressive way. He came from a kind of academic place, as a lot of artists do, and evolved into works that are so expressive they could have been formed out of lava. Here you see, for example, Leda and the Swan. So here's a beautiful, a little elegant work that's dealing with the great classics. A brilliant example of Reuben Nakian's expressive, expressionist works is this work here, Voyage to Crete. Again, evocative of the great classics, the expressive work. It's a new approach to sculpture, and he was doing this kind of work, and even more abstract to some degree, as early as the late 1940s. So when we contrast it with, say, someone like de Kooning, who did his first sculptures in 1969, I believe, we can't help but imagine de Kooning walking into the Museum of Modern Art, seeing this enormous installation of Nakian sculpture. We have this opportunity to consider an artist that should be and is among the great 20th century American sculptors. Elie Nadelman, another of the formidable Americans. Nadelman was not born in America, but came to America early on, born in Warsaw, Poland, went to Paris, engaged with the avant-garde, was very important for sculpture of that period, introduced to Cubism and the like, evolved in America, discovering a lot of the folk art, and the work took on a bit of a different direction. And here we have these wonderful, sweet, small ceramic works that he was commissioned to do in the early 40s. We see Nadelman, we see Chaim Gross, another of the foreign-born Americans that came to America and had a significant impact on the scene at the time. In having made reference to abstract expressionism in the works of Nakian, in Europe there was an equivalence to abstract expressionism. The Cobra movement was founded. These were young artists who were reacting to works that really reflected a more primal approach to art. A lot of these artists came to maturity in terms of their work during the World War II. Now imagine being in a bomb shelter and making art. The idea of creating delicate still life flowers or portraits just wasn't that interesting. They were reactive and wanted to deal with something more primal. They were dealing with the innocence of children's art, for example. Here we have a work from 1963 by Karl Appel, or some would say Appel, but he was Dutch and the pronunciation is Appel. So we have this gouache here. These artists forming the Cobra movement all met through a surrealist conference. A great many of them did in Paris post-war. And the movement itself only lasted a couple of years as a formal movement where there were composers, there were philosophers, there were sculptors and painters, published manifestos. And today there are museums of just Cobra. Appel was one of the founding members. The reason for the term Cobra is the centers of most of these artists were Copenhagen, Brussels, and Amsterdam. Appel being from Amsterdam. We also have a wonderful, playful wall sculpture by Appel, who you can see the kind of innocence and playfulness of the artist's interest. He was actually a great collector of toys, and we see that reflected in the work here. The impact of Cobra sustains today. Here we have a work of a very fascinating painter, sculptor by the name of Peter Lin Busk from Copenhagen. Very much in the influence and manner of the Cobra movement. A remarkable effect of this ceramic sculpture, and it evokes in its kind of playful manner a horse and rider subject. Other artists of the 20th century that were impacted and peripherally aligned with surrealism are seen here. For example, here we have works by Alexander Calder in this gouache, which served in fact as the model for an original lithograph that he was to create in 1965. We have here Claire Falkenstein, a heroic sculptor that was working in Paris after the war. In 1950, she went to Paris. She was from Coos Bay, Oregon, by way of San Francisco. In Paris, she was provocative. She was a form giver to so many artists. Imagine a woman in Paris at a time when women weren't given great access and consideration, that here's this artist using a torch, welding. This was a revelatory. And in Paris, she attracted the attention of the most important critics of contemporary art. Her studio became a central point where so many of the California artists in particular that went to Paris post-war would gather because they knew they would meet significant people in her studio. Here we have what is an absolutely masterful work, what she would call the point. And her works were always expansive, thinking of an expanding universe. And you see here, nothing is closed. Imagine it just being ever expanding. A gouache by Claire Falkenstein. We were privileged to do a number of very formidable exhibitions of her works. And today, her works have finally achieved the kind of recognition long, long overdue. And yet, she was acknowledged from very early on. Her works were even shown in the Musée des Arts Décoratifs, which in Paris. Early on, her designs were presented there, a branch of the Louvre. So in referencing Claire Falkenstein, her early education included having worked with and studied under Archipenko. Alexander Archipenko was one of the formidable figures of early modernist sculpture, and here we have this 1930 example of a watercolor by Archipenko of this woman with her arms raised. We recently presented a wonderful exhibition of the works of George Nama, a New York sculptor and painter and printmaker. And with these artists, all these disparate works that you see here, Claire Falkenstein, Calder, Nama, interestingly, they all have something in common besides their broad impact of surrealism. They all worked with Stanley William Hayter in Paris, where they all created etchings and got, in a sense, a beginnings in terms of the development of remarkable contemporary etchings. So again, this exhibition, without intent, brings together artists that were absolutely related, and that's the context that is so important for this gallery, because context gives meaning to all these works. Surrealists' impact is felt throughout Europe, even for those that don't really align themselves as surrealists. Here we have the alchemy of this remarkable sculptor, Jordi Alcaras. You see the conceptual workings of an artist who has broken the frame, creating works that have as much to do with our relationship to the work, the space between, and the evolution of a work's making. Indeed, this is entitled "To Catch a Drawing in Flight." And you see this undulation of the whole work released from its frame. In this work, the process of creating a still life, an impossibility, this absolute solid steel figure is drawn in this fashion. This wire literally goes through this work. So there's this wonderful playfulness, but a deadly serious concept in terms of questioning how imagery evolves. One of the big surprises in the exhibition is a sculpture by Ed Ruscha. This represents one of only 2 sculptures in bronze created by Ruscha. And here we have this, again, a kind of surreal play of words where he creates this monument reflective, for me at least, of not only the kinds of billboards that he would have seen driving cross country from Oklahoma, but also it has a feel for me of also a monitor with the stand. And so it bridges times between his coming out to Los Angeles and how we've evolved to this realm of technology. Now that's evocative for me. I don't know that Ed Ruscha would have gone to the notion of the monitor, but that's the beauty of a great work of art. It's evocative, not merely descriptive. In addition to this work, we have a very interesting, playful work of Ed Ruscha's, the great musical personality, Artie Shaw, band leader, musician, was very close to the Venice art crowd of the artists. And Artie Shaw was about to turn 91, and Ed Ruscha made this work for Artie Shaw to keep him forever young, and he created this work, 90, in this painting we see here. So in contrast to Ed Ruscha's work here, in this playfulness and his intrigue with certain phrases, in this case one that he has used on more than one occasion, he's appeared in paintings as well, Gal chews same piece of gum since 1970. A kind of surrealist game of words. In that contrast of playfulness comes the seriousness and reactive qualities of Alison Saar's work. This work by Alison Saar, a contemporary artist, is dealing with the African diaspora in this work from her Spain series. And you see here painted an African male. It's evocative of those that toiled and the troubles and difficulties engaged in their evolution. An important aspect of assemblage is evident in the works of Arman, among the best known artists working in the medium, a very important French sculptor, painter, and here we see this assemblage of parts of a violin and brushes and on canvas. So again, we've expanded the dialogue and conversation of assemblage, sculpture, and we move then to other artists such as Gordon Wagner, who was really one of the preeminent artists of a particular period, huge impact to the Beat generation here on the West Coast. He was a beachcomber, collected things along the way and found the magic of finding new uses for a shape and a form, hugely impacted by the works of Dali and Magritte. So you see, surrealism continues to make an impact even way beyond those that were formerly associated with it. And these drawers contained numbers of found objects that would find their place sometimes in his sculpture. It's a wonderful work from, 1950, that I was delighted to acquire from his widow some years later. I'm thrilled to be able to present it here. And here we have another work by Gordon Wagner titled Mercator. It's evocative of navigation, I guess his time on the beach. Gordon Wagner's impact was greatly felt by one of his contemporaries, a much younger artist, the youngest of that beat generation, and a formidable force in that period of assemblages, and that's George Herms, who again found objects that felt that they needed to be together. He found new poetic ways of creating things as he viewed them. And the poetry is very much seen here in these disparate objects forming a composition. Robert Graham, another of Los Angeles' preeminent sculptors. Here we see a unique work by Robert Graham that dates from 1985. Brandon Belanger, who's an artist, biologist, profound environmentalist, has seized upon an entire body of work where he seeks out these antique prints that depict an animal, an insect, a bird that is no longer on our planet. He's taken this image of this butterfly and cut it out, taken that shape and sets it to flames, taking the ashes and placing the urn here, rest in peace, with the name of the species that was last seen on this planet in 1895 in Jamaica. And he documents this, and to see an exhibition of his works with this series, it's unreal to see animals of all scale occupying a room by the hundreds of those that are no longer here. A formidable artist that I have the pleasure and honor of having introduced to the west coast of America was Honolor Baron. And here we have a German-born artist who was deeply affected by witnessing difficulties, horrors on Crystal Night, to see her own family brutalized. It impacted her greatly, and ultimately came to America, studied design and art, and these poignant works, these assemblages and collages that she produced were always about survival. The materials had to be old, it had to sustain. We're so proud of having had this association with Honolor Baron's works over the years and having done several exhibitions of her work. And surely one of the most well-known sculptors in America, women sculptors, was Louise Nevelson. And here we have a 1957 collage that shows a kind of pared-down elegance, which is very typical of her wall pieces that she did at the time. So in summation, we see this random exhibition, which may as well be tightly curated with artists with profound associations in spite of themselves. The impact that has been made by history is absolutely essential. And today, in a time where perhaps a little less context is given to art as a moment of sensation takes over context, we're here to say you can be a part of this. And these are works of art that deserve your consideration. And for me at least, I get to see all these old friends together as a reunion that I could not have anticipated. And I hope to share it over this summer with so many visitors.